I don't know if anyone else in the room is like me, but I'm going to guess that there are at least a few of you who will be able to relate to this thought pattern. And it's a thought pattern that I think plagues many of us for quite a lot of our lives, and it's this response to a situation. I have nothing I can do, or I have nothing I can give, depending on the circumstances. We find ourselves at times in life feeling like we have nothing to offer. A few accounts from my own life. I found I had nothing to offer in maths lessons. That was a pretty consistent part of my childhood. I also found that I had very little to offer in science lessons, especially in group projects, where I was often designated the one that carried stuff, which I nailed, but I didn't really have a lot to offer on a scientific level. I revisited that feeling as I grew up, spending 89 minutes on the bench during football matches, only to be given enough time on the pitch to get wet. And then, of course, for many of us, we'll be able to relate to some of these situations as we've grown older, to sit with friends who are battling illness, to have prayed with those going through horrendous personal situations, to watch the news as armies march on defenseless cities, or read articles of younger millionaires whilst the cost of living has grown. It is not uncommon for us to be in situations and wonder, what on earth have I got to give? To be left feeling like we have nothing to offer in the reality and the challenges of the situations we face. And yet the truth is, it's not just held for outside of the church. For many of us, we will be sat in here looking at what's happening with church, with faith, and conclude that we have very little to offer. I wonder how many of us in life have felt like we have nothing to offer, nothing to bring to the table. So this morning, my prayer is, and has been in this week as we've built up to Sunday, that this morning would serve as a comfort, but also as a gentle kick on the backside, that this simple truth is true for everyone. Every single person in this space has something to offer. Everyone. There is no one that statement is not true for. Everyone has something to offer in any given situation. So my prayer is you would find comfort in the passage that we take together this morning, but you would also be gently encouraged that if that is true, there's something we need to do about it. So if you're anything like me, as I grew up in church, some of you would have already started the list of reasons why I have nothing to offer. I would encourage you to pause. Some of you are already very aware of the situations you face and are left questioning, what do I have to offer in this reality? Again, please pause. And listen as Sharon comes to this passage from 2 Kings of maybe we do have something to offer. So as Sharon comes, if you have a Bible with you on your phones in physical form, then please do turn to 2 Kings and follow along as we hear these words. Thank you.
The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is come in to take my 2 boys as his slaves." Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of olive oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Put oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left."
I love this story. It is short, it is to the point, but it leaves me stood here with the confidence to say there is no one in this room who has nothing to offer. Please remember and please take the context of the story. This is not a parable that Jesus is telling. This is an Old Testament account of something that happened. So we can sit here in the knowledge that none of us are beyond the reality and the truth of having something to offer. So this morning, I want us to walk through this passage. We're going to journey through it just to begin to pick up on some of these things and for us to hopefully grasp what it is that we have to bring. This opening passage, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord, but now his creditor is coming to take my boys as his slave." The reality of life is that it is hard. Look at the context of this moment. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets. This was a godly man. This was a good man. This is a good family. This is a church family. They were here every Sunday. And yet the reality is the challenges of life have meant that the creditor is coming to take her boys as slaves. I will never stand at the front of this church and tell you that if you become a Christian, everything gets easier. The reality of life for those who know Jesus and who don't know Jesus is it is hard. There are challenges that we will face, and this story is embedded into a context of that truth. A godly family, a prophet. And yet there is a reality coming that her boys will be taken as slaves. This passage serves to remind us that even in the midst of that, and you would have heard it through the prayer, in the midst of that, God is at work. God is doing something, and sometimes we just have to look a little bit harder to see what it is that he is doing. The circumstances each of us face will differ. They're going to vary from person to person, but we can be left in that moment where we feel like we have no way of getting through, nothing to give, nothing to offer. I wonder how many of us find ourselves feeling like the woman. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" Your servant has nothing there at all. What do I have to offer? Nothing. I've got nothing. Maybe people have asked you, how can you get involved? Your response, I'm not really that good at anything. Why don't you come along to Messy Church and help out? I don't really like kids. Go and speak to your neighbor. I don't really like talking to strangers. Make them a cup of tea. I don't really drink hot drinks. Help clean up after the event. I'm allergic to hard work. Tell me what you are good at. And that was for me. Most of us will come back with a reason why we have nothing to offer. It's almost human nature to assume we can bring nothing to the table. We see in this passage, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all. I have nothing, Elisha, that I can bring to the table to solve the problem before me. It may sound dramatic on this sun-soaked Sunday morning, but each of us will have been there at times. If we take a moment, each of us will be able to remember times, situations we faced where we felt like our response is to say, we have nothing. But I have nothing to bring to the table here. Solve the problem, face the challenge, nothing. Of course, that isn't the entirety of that dialogue. Elisha replied to her, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?" First response, "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a small jar of oil." We're going to take a pause, a very intentional pause, and I've decided to call it an Elisha moment. A pause for us to consider even the most tiny, insignificant thing that we might have that will be our jar of oil. What do you have? Uniquely you. For some, it's time. No, I actually have a bit of time on my hands. Others of you have a mobile phone with WhatsApp. Some of you have a garden and 2 chairs. What is it that you have that you would dismiss as nothing, but if you stop and think about it, could become this small jar of oil? So we're going to take a very deliberate moment just to consider, what is it that I have, no matter how insignificant, how small it may appear, that I can offer in this moment? don't panic, I'm not going to ask you. But I wonder, for those of you that have engaged with this, what your small jar of olive oil is. What is that small, almost insignificant thing that maybe for years you have dismissed, but yet could be monumental in the face of the challenges around us? I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is any of you have maybe considered, what any of you have concluded, but I can guarantee you this, because this story tells us whatever it is wonderful. It is amazing. And no matter how good it is or how bland it is, when it is placed into the hands of God, it will do amazing things. So as we journey this story, please hold on to whatever it is that you have to bring, no matter how insignificant it may appear. The woman comes, explains the situation, tells him first and foremost, I have nothing, and then says, well, I've got this jar of oil at the back of the cupboards. This is his response. Elisha said, go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't just ask for a few. And go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. This, I find, is the downer of the story. We like the idea of finding something in our lives that is useful. We like the idea of God using it. For some of us, we don't really like the idea of doing anything. Because at this moment, what she has to offer is going to need to be engaged with. There is going to be something demanded of her. She's going to have to step out and respond and act. Maybe you've sat there and you found your jar of oil, but you have no intention of doing anything with it. I know what I could offer, not really down for the hard work. Sometimes, if I'm honest, I'll give that answer of I'm not really sure what I have to offer. Because the truth is, sometimes I can't be bothered. Sometimes there are opportunities and situations that we face where the truth is we'd rather just not get involved, even when we know we've got something to bring to the table. It's funny how often I find myself praying for situations for God to get involved, and as soon as I've said amen, I put my feet up on the table and take a sip of my coffee with no intention of seeing if God's calling me to act. I find what it is I can bring, but the idea of engaging with it, of doing something, seems like a challenge. Maybe a better way for us to be a people of prayer, as you've heard me speak about from the front, is to pray with our shoes next to us. So that when we utter that amen, we put our shoes on with the expectation of God to send us to do something about it. To encourage God to be a part of what we're doing first and foremost, but not to stop there. Not to finish with the prayer, but to finish the prayer with action. Because Elisha hears about the woman's little jar of oil and doesn't scoff. He doesn't dismiss it as insignificant, doesn't ask her if she has anything of any more value. He doesn't even ask how big the jar is. His response on hearing that the lady has anything to offer is quite simply, go. Go. I genuinely believe it really didn't matter what it was that she said she had. I believe the response would have been, go. Trust what you do have into the hands of God and act upon it. Engage with it. Do something with it. Go. Which means we now have some fairly cold, hard facts that each of us has to deal with. There is no one in this room that has nothing to offer. No one. And everyone in this room is called to go with what it is they have. There is no one that this doesn't reach. No one this doesn't speak to if we choose to hear it. In fact, if we allow it to, this sounds a lot like the mobilization of the church being lived out in someone's living room. Bringing what we have to offer and using it, not just sitting on it. A small jar of oil, a simple command to go. Go ask for more empty jars, and then maybe my favorite part of this passage, My favorite part of this passage, don't ask for just a few. I wonder how many of us look at what it is that we have to bring to the table, look at the gifts and the skills we have, and assume we know how far they will go. Not Elisha. Don't ask for just a few. I am fairly sure, because I am human, the lady's response would have been in her head to be going, okay, 3 or 4 maybe, and I can walk them down a little bit. Don't just ask for a few. In other words, don't you dare pretend to think you know what God is capable of. Don't for a minute assume you will quantify what God can do. Don't just ask for a few. God is a God of abundance, a God who brought manna in the desert, protection from the lion, food for 5,000. So don't you dare go around just asking for a few. Ask for abundance. Ask for everything that God has and everything God is going to do. Step out in faith. Because that's what we're seeing here. We're now talking about someone who started by saying they had nothing and is now stepping out in faith to see what God is doing. Don't just ask for a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into the jars, and as each one is filled, put it to one side. As each one is filled, put it to one side. The faith in this moment is incredibly profound. At no point do we read of the woman laughing. This is ridiculous. Let's just all be honest here. This is ridiculous. She has a small jar of oil and she's asking for more jars and she's going to fill them. Well, that doesn't make sense. I know I said I sit fairly absent-mindedly during my maths lessons, but even I know small jar, many jars doesn't equate. We see nothing of that. We see no back chat. We see faith in action. Simple faith. Simple faith to shut the door. Simple faith to follow these commands. There is nothing of our human reactions visible here. Instead, we see that faith action lived out. We see that faith action lived out as she simply shuts the door and slowly and deliberately begins to. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." And the oil stopped flowing. I don't know where you particularly engage with passages, whether you read the whole story or whether you're one of those people that focuses in on an element that speaks to you. But verse 6 speaks to me. It's the thing that I've come back to time and time again, and isn't massively a huge point of the preach, but it's something that I felt incredibly challenged by. So I want to be a verse 6 kind of person. Remember how we started. I have nothing. Same woman, bring me another one. She's gone from I've got nothing to give to, oh my gosh, I have something to give and I want to keep giving. Bring me another one. Bring me another one. The procession of jars keeps going. She is now walking in this faith, living it out, engaged in what God is doing. She's gone from I have nothing to give to this abundance of wanting more of what God is doing. Are we prepared to be people that want to keep giving, keep being at the center of what God is doing? Before we move on, I want to just recap where we are. I don't want anyone to miss out on what's happening in this passage. We begin with that response of I have nothing to give. Many, if not every one of us, will probably have to admit we've been there. Those of you that chose to have engaged with this idea of taking a moment to consider, what do we actually have? What is our little jar of olive oil? We're called to go, to act on what we have. We're called to show faith as we step out. And then this amazing moment, bring me another one. Bring me another one. I wonder which jar it was when the woman stopped worrying about running dry? Was it the first jar, the 10th, 30th? At what point was she filling and she stopped worrying that it was going to run dry? Because that's how it would have started. She would have begun to wonder, when does this finish? What point was it where she stopped that worry? I wonder what point it was where she stopped pouring slowly. How many of us have done that? That tentative, I'm just going to do it slowly because it might go further. I tend to do that when I realize I don't have cooking oil and need more cooking oil. If I do it slowly, there'll be more of it. When did she stop pouring slowly and just pour in the faith of the abundance of God? I wonder at what point it was where she started to laugh to herself at the outrageous gift that God was giving, overwhelmed by the joy of God's provision in the face of a reality of losing her sons to slavery. And yet in the midst of what God was doing, I wonder when she just chuckled, overwhelmed by his love. You wonder at what point she began to cry, aware she was living in the moment of the miracle, aware that what was happening before her eyes as she poured and she poured and she poured meant that there was a different outcome to the situation she was facing. The reality that her sons would not be taken dawns upon her, and the emotion of a mother begins to well up. I wonder how her heart leapt for joy as she began to realize there was another way possible. We can read these passages and very easily disengage with the humanity of it. But this is the account of a mother who's running the risk of losing everything and is invited into the midst of what God is doing to be a part of the solution. There would have been an emotional roller coaster in that house with those doors shut. She poured and she poured. And then she asked for another jar to fill. One of her sons replies to her, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. There is not a jar left. The reality of that statement is there is not an empty jar left in this village, because the sons have gone and taken every jar that was on offer. Not just, and every single one of them has been used. And then, and only then, did the oil stop flowing. Again, it reminds me of that wonderful moment in Exodus as the manna comes from heaven and God says to them, "Take only what you need. My provision is enough, and it will come again tomorrow. Take only what you need." Once all the jars were filled, then, and only then, did the oil stop flowing. A God of abundance, but not a God of excess. A God who has more than we could ever imagine to give, but does not just give for the sake of giving, but gives as we step out in faith. Could the oil have gone further? Of course it could. It's already filled all the jars in the village. Did it need to? No. A God of abundance, but not a God of excess. A God who knows exactly what it is we need and how much we need, and he makes sure that we have all we need in any given situation. Her little jar of oil flowed and flowed until there was nowhere else to pour it. Then it stopped. When there was nowhere else for you to serve, nowhere else for you to give out in that situation, when that mission, when that opportunity has come to an end, that's when it's finished. Not when we decide. When God lets the oil stop flowing. After the oil stopped flowing, she went and told the man of God. I wonder how expectant he was of this conversation. She went and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." Faith in action. That's what this is. Faith in action, bringing what it is that I have to the feet of God and saying, God, I don't know what this does. I don't know how this is going to work, but I'm going to trust you and I'm going to journey with you. I'm going to be a part of what it is. And one day I will sit and reflect and see the joy of the fruits of our labor working with Creator God. Some of us need to take these moments to look back on our lives and go, you know what, actually, yeah, I can see where God's been at work. I can find joy in that moment. It was hard, but I can reflect on what God has been doing. In this moment, this reality of faith in action is the freedom from the chains of financial burden. The breakthrough of the pressure and the reality that was faced. For others in our own situations, it could be the restoration of health, the restoring of relationships, clarity on our future, the capacity to journey with someone and stand beside them in the realities of what it is that they face. It can be something to do with education, with mission, with salvation. Whatever we bring to the table, God will use. The prayers that we pray, we may be part of the answer to. If we take what it is that we have, and we step out and we go with the faith that God will be involved. Bringing what I have, no matter how insignificant it seems, and trusting it into the hands of God. There is no one in this room that has nothing to offer. There's no one in this room that hasn't got a part to play in ushering in God's kingdom. As I close, I want to make one more point. One more point in this incredible story that I encourage you, spend your Sunday sat in the sun just reading it again. Letting the reality of what it is soak in. But one final point. The woman started with one small jar of oil. She brought all that she had to God. All that she had, she brought before him. And then as she filled jar after jar after jar, oil stopped flowing. The woman was left with, I would well imagine, hundreds of jars of oil and one empty jar. One empty jar remained amongst the abundance of all that God had done, and it was the jar that she started with. You see, there's something incredibly powerful about being willing to pour out all that we have into God's hands and seeing how he can use it and multiply it and work it for the wonders of his good. You see, for my life, and I can speak for myself, and I'm sure others can relate, I hold on so tight to what it is that I have. I almost strangle out the opportunity for God to use it. So concerned that what happens if I give away all that I have, God? What if I give up all my time? When am I going to have downtime? What happens if I give away that gift, that offering, that time, that money, whatever it might be, God? What is going to be at the end for me? We hold on so tight to our tiny jar that we miss out on the abundance of what God can do with the little that we bring in faith. The woman started with one small jar of oil. By the end of the process, she no longer had one small jar of oil. That jar was empty. But she was surrounded by the abundance of God's love, of God's provision, of what God can do with the little that we bring to the table. What this story teaches me is this: no matter how tightly I hold on to what it is that I have, what I have will never even come close to what it is that God has for me. What is it that you can bring to the table? The Bible is full of these stories of people who bring the very last of what they have before God and see him work in amazing ways. People who step out in faith with tiny glimpses of what it is God might be doing. And yet God comes through. The challenge for us is, How do we stop assuming that that God of provision stopped providing when the Bible finished? I'm going to ask Anne to come and share a story for us from Corrie ten Boom, from The Hidden Place. Thank you.
Another strange thing was happening. The Davitamin bottle was continuing to produce drops. It scarcely seemed possible. So small a bottle, so many doses a day. Now, in addition to Betsy, a dozen others on our pier were taking it. My instinct was always to hoard it. Betsy was growing so very weak, but others were ill as well. It was hard to say no to eyes that burned with fever, hands that shook with chill. I tried to save it for the very weakest, but even these soon numbered 15, 20, 25. And still, every time I tilted the little bottle, a drop appeared at the tip of the glass stopper. It just couldn't be. I held it up to the light, trying to see how much was left, but the dark brown glass was too thick to see through. There was a woman in the Bible, Betsy said, whose oil jar was never empty. She turned it to the Book of Kings, the story of the poor widow of Zarephath, who gave Elijah a room in her home. The jar of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of Jehovah, which he spoke by Elijah. Well, wonderful things happened all through the Bible. It was one thing to believe that such things are possible thousands of years ago, another to have it happen now to us this very day. And yet it happened this day and the next and the next, until an awed little group of spectators stood around watching the drops fall onto the daily rations of bread. Many nights I lay awake in the shower of straw dust from the mattress above, trying to fathom the marvel of supply lavished upon us. Maybe, I whispered to Betsy, only a molecule or two really gets through that little pinhole, and then in the air it expands. I heard her soft laughter in the dark. Don't try too hard to explain it, Corrie. Just accept it as a surprise from a father who loves you. And then one day, Mian pushed her way to us in the evening food line. Look what I got for you, Mian said. She was a pretty young Dutch woman we'd met in Vught. She was assigned to the hospital and often managed to bring to Barracks 28 some stolen treasures from the staff room. A sheet of newspaper to stuff in a broken window, a slice of bread left untouched on a nurse's plate. Now we peered into the small cloth sack she carried. Vitamins, I cried, and then cast an apprehensive glance at a policeman nearby. She's come out, yes, she whispered. There were several huge jars. I emptied each just the same amount. We gulped the thin tonic water, marveling at our sudden riches. Back at the bunk, I took the bottle from the straw. We'll finish the drops first, I decided. But that night, no matter how long I held it upside down or how hard I shook it, not another drop appeared.
In the midst of a concentration camp, Corrie ten Boom wrote these words. It was one thing to believe that such things were possible thousands of years ago. Another to have it happen now to us this very day. God is not finished. His abundance is not run. The challenge for us is to take the small and to step out in faith. would you bow your heads with me as I pray?